Hello, I'm Andrew Hill, senior business writer at the Financial Times. I'm very fortunate to be joined today by Andrew Leon Hanna, former winner of the Financial Times and McKinsey Bracken Bower Prize for budding young business writers. Andrew's a lawyer, social entrepreneur, and author from Jacksonville, Florida. He won the Bracken Bower Prize in 2018 for his business book proposal about the rise of entrepreneurial ideas in refugee communities. Last year, Andrew returned to the award as a judge. His forthcoming book, 25 Million Sparks, the Untold Story of Refugee Entrepreneurs, evolved from his prize-winning proposal and will be published later this month by Cambridge University Press. Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We're delighted to have you back with us at the Financial Times, and many congratulations for publication of the book. It follows the lives of three courageous Syrian women living in one of the world's largest refugee camps who are determined to make a better life for themselves in the face of incredible adversity and setbacks. But it also takes the reader much further, telling this broader tale about the global power of refugee entrepreneurship. So just tell us a bit more about the book. What was the inspiration and why did you feel it was important to tell this story?
Absolutely, Andrew. Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, particularly having worked with the Financial Times on the prize and having received that a few years ago. It's been a really wonderful journey, and I'm so appreciative of the chance to kind of culminate that here talking with you. So 25 Million Sparks, just as you said, is a story of refugee entrepreneurs. It's meant to be a story of hope and dignity. And it's meant to focus on these three Syrian entrepreneurs in the Za'atari camp, Esma, Melek, and Yasmina. Esma being a storyteller and a children's teacher and a poet in the camp who kind of uplifts the heads of many Syrian children who've dealt with very unjust lives and having to deal with so many topics that no child should deal with. Melek, who's an artist and uses her incredible, beautiful, powerful art again, to encourage younger people and older people alike in the camp by kind of pouring out her heart and her emotions in that work and advocating for human rights issues as well. And then Yasmina, who is a wedding dress shop and salon owner who has probably the most striking shop in the world, certainly the most striking shop I've ever seen, and has just built this kind of business built on celebrating people and brides and grooms in the camp, at a time where I think it would have been, some might say that, it'd be hard to celebrate in a camp. And so all of these women, represent kind of this dignity and beauty in the lives of refugees. And then in the 20 camps and cities that I follow, it's the same thing. And to answer your question, the reason I wrote it is because, the last few years, and now certainly with what's going on in Ukraine, there have been stories and stories in the media about refugees. And often they are, the way I put it is they're portrayed as victims or as villains. So they're one-dimensionally portrayed either way, and they're often portrayed as victims, people who should be looked down upon because they don't have their own agency, they don't have their own, they're pitiful beings that need our handouts. And then the other side is they're villains. So they're criminals coming to take our jobs, et cetera. And the problem with that is that it's inaccurate. And the other problem is that no human being is fully a victim or a villain. And so it dehumanizes refugees on a level that's not equal to everyone else. And so what I wanted to do was, my deep belief is that when you can tell stories about human beings who are different than one another, we can build bridges and actually understand that actually we have more in common than we are different, and that there's a lot of beauty, power, and dignity in every human being alike. And so by taking readers into the lives of these three women in particular, and then zooming out to many other people around the world, my hope is that people will look past some of this cacophony of noises and media headlines and political speeches and see refugees for who they are, which is some of the most vibrant, dynamic, incredible people in the world.
You use in the business, it is a business book. I mean, this is a business book proposal prize that you won, but 25 Million Sparks does use some pretty innovative storytelling approaches. You feature the work of the refugees that you are center of the story, for example. Tell us a bit more about how you came to that model for the book.
Definitely. Yeah, I think the kind of human brain often latches onto stories is something, I've known and seen in my life. And so I didn't want to just, talk at a high level. I wanted to anchor it deeply into the lives of people that you could get to know and hopefully feel sort of a relationship with in the book. And so a lot of the reasoning for how I ingrained in the lives of Esma, Melek, and Yasmina is because, they're three of the most inspiring people I've ever met. They have, we get to know their families. We get to know their journey from Syria, many really difficult things. Difficult isn't the right word. Very, very challenging and tragic things that they had to deal with and that their families and friends had to deal with. And you take that journey from what we call darkness to the spark, which is when they were in the camp coming up with the idea, and then revival, and then hope. Well, what are they thinking now? Because certainly that, nobody should live in a refugee camp. So there's still, what is it that they're kind of thinking going forward? And so if we could, my hope was if we can tell these stories in a way that is really empowering of the entrepreneurs, and I should say kind of centered on their voice, then people will get to know them. And then that will be a window to be interested in and learn. And most importantly, that they will kind of see this, equal dignity, the fact that, Syria is no different than any other country. They were living in peace and comfort, and everything was, they never would have imagined something like this would have happened, just like many of us living in our own places. But this occurred. And so I think by telling the story, hopefully people can say, oh, for some reason, maybe I thought they were really different, but actually this is the same. And I'm incredibly inspired by these people, when maybe in the past I've been told to look at them as other or as down for whatever reason. And then to your point, to make the business points and arguments and analyze kind of the startup environment in the Za'atari camp and in 20 camps and cities around the world, we would use that. The goal was that in telling the stories, it would basically tell a broader kind of narrative about these things. So, we talk about the darkness of refugees in Za'atari and these three women. And then I take a step back and say, well, here's the global refugee crisis. And there's similar darkness in, dozens of places around the world where there's conflict and political instability. And then when we talk about Spark, we then, there's the chapters on storytelling, and then it zooms out and says, okay, now, why is it that there is such a refugee entrepreneurial movement? It's not just Melek, Esma, and Yasmina. It's, refugees are often 1.5 to 2x more entrepreneurial than native-born citizens. So then it takes a step and says, well, here are the 5 reasons why refugees are incredible entrepreneurs, some of the best in the world. Right. And then finally, going into revival, Esma, Yasmina, and Melek have made such a big difference in Za'atari camp. Well, they've also, it's a snippet of the impact that people have made in Utica, New York, in Yorkshire, England, in Port Adelaide, Australia, and in Cairo, Egypt, and so many other places.
Yes, you use the sort of 2 views, the very close perspective on the camp and the pulling back to those broader global statistics, shocking statistics about the number of refugees, but also hopeful ones about the things that are done. And I think that in many ways, it sort of epitomizes what we were looking for in the Bracken Bower Prize and what we look for in our annual Business Book of the Year award, providing a compelling and enjoyable insight into business issues. Did you find it difficult to combine that dual approach, the engaging stories, the first-hand interviews and the human experiences with the more structured and analytical arguments?
I did. I think it was a challenge. I think where I ended up was sort of dividing it. There are some elements where some writers will take the approach of trying to interweave a lot of it. For me, it was a little more like 3 chapters on telling the most compelling story about Esma, Yasmina, Melek, and other entrepreneurs in Za'atari. And then let's take a quick step back, almost as if, this beautiful story, let's take a little break from it. And then let's talk more broadly so that we know how this relates to the global element. There's some weaving in and out, but I actually felt, and just from people I shared it with feedback, I felt that was probably the best way to do it. I think the analytical thing came more naturally to me, just having been a lawyer and, done like law review editing and things like that. I think that part was more natural. but trying to weave it in felt forced as well. The other thing I'd say is that the storytelling part, actually focusing on that part, was easier than I thought it would be, just because I used an approach that I sort of call like human-centered or amplifying the voices of the subject. I think often I've seen in books, especially narrative nonfiction, the approach tends to be a little more, somebody embeds themselves in the community and observes. And my approach was a little bit more, I want to amplify the voices of these folks, because I'm never going to know what it's like to be in a refugee camp. My parents are from Egypt, so I have some relationship to the culture and the language, but I'm very far removed from their lives. And so how can I do my best to bring their authentic voice into the book? And so a lot of what I did was their quotes and them telling the story and me just kind of supporting that. Right. And so actually I found the storytelling in that way to be both more aligned with the purpose of the book, and B, easier. And then in that spirit, weaving in I call it a creative collaboration with them, because we weaved in art from Melek, who's the artist, and poems from Esma, just to, again, kind of emphasize this is about their power and dignity, not about my observations or right. Assessment.
Yes, it's very effective, as I say. Obviously, the book tells the story of their flight from Syria, but I couldn't help but notice the strong parallels with what we're witnessing now in Ukraine as people are driven out of their homes, forced to flee. I wonder what sort of lessons, clearly the Ukraine crisis came too late for inclusion in the book, but what sort of lessons do you draw from the two crises and the challenges and opportunities that face refugees from both those conflicts?
Yes, absolutely. I when I wrote the book, when I started writing the book, when I wrote the proposal, it was called 25 Million Sparks. It's still called 25 Million Sparks because we didn't want to change the name. But, very tragically, that's because there were 25 million refugees in late 2018. When I published the book, it was about 26.4. And just over the last couple of months, it's now upwards of 30 because of the 5.5 or so, as we're talking, refugees who have fled Ukraine because of the Russian invasion. And so, it's everything is more amplified, right? So the importance of integrating refugees, both as a moral issue, first and foremost, as an issue of global concern that, we've agreed, after World War II, that as a world, we will welcome in those who don't have a home and those who are fleeing because of persecution, violence, or war. So both as a moral issue, this has now become even more imperative as the numbers have ballooned even further. And then as an economic issue, which I would say is secondary, but also very important, realizing all of the kind of countries that are now making a decision about Ukraine and about Syria and about other countries, that, hey, this is not just moral and selfless, it's also actually dramatically economically beneficial. There was a study done over 10 years in the US by the US government showing that refugees have a net fiscal impact of upwards of $60 billion over that 10-year period, I believe it was. And so, even above and beyond the investment it takes to welcome refugees, to bring them in, it's important to recognize it's a clear advantage because of their entrepreneurial abilities, because of their cross-cultural abilities to create new companies and with kind of new market ideas, because of their grit, because of their reliability, because of their going all in. They don't often have backup options. So as entrepreneurs, they're the most extreme entrepreneurs. And because of what they do to revive spiritual communities, churches, mosques, what they do to help us in our times of greatest need. For example, folks during Hurricane Harvey in Houston, Afghan refugees, the Afghan Cultural Center helping out firemen and women during that time. There's a story in the book of an Iranian refugee who during COVID-19 created supplies for folks. And so just in the midst of this time where countries are making decisions and communities are making decisions about, well, what do we do? How much do we play a role? I think it's important to remember, this could have been anyone. These are equal human beings who deserve dignity and respect. And we have a moral imperative to welcome them. And our world has really failed dramatically on that front, which I can talk more about. And not only that, but also for our own community self-interest. These are people who are going to be employing millions of people in our community and actually being part of our team to solve our nation's problems. So I think there's a number of kind of ways that folks can contribute. I think the first at the highest level is, as I mentioned, the kind of global community has really failed on the front of welcoming and supporting refugees, in the sense that less than 1% of all refugees in the world are formally resettled. And so that means most folks are in this kind of transitory, kind of unjust life. And then 85% of folks around the world who are refugees are in countries that are developing or not higher income countries. And so that kind of is a difficult spot for the country and for the refugees. And so there's an element of advocacy and voting and deciding. This to me is not actually a political issue. It should be an issue of humanity and morality. And so just thinking about advocating, your legislators in whatever country you're in, to make bigger commitments to refugees, to increase that times many, recognizing that it's a moral imperative and it will be economically beneficial for everybody, and societally beneficial in terms of, again, these kind of intangible, beautiful moments that refugees create in their communities and in their houses of worship, in their times of need, and their friendships and camaraderie and all of this. It's really a beautiful thing that shouldn't be missed, and has revived many cities in the US and in Australia and England and other places. So there's this higher level advocacy. And then there's the lower level, I just mean on the ground work that can be done. In many countries in the US, for example, there are refugee resettlement centers, immigrant welcoming centers at the YMCA, for example, that are completely geared towards providing support to refugees once they arrive. And so having a kind of plug into that in your community, whether it be if you have the means to give to them, they're extraordinarily underfunded normally, but doing heroic work and have wonderful staffs, to be, if you work for a company, finding ways to partner and provide services to those organizations. And then I think volunteering your time and even as little as, one of the beautiful things about these stories that come up, and in my work supporting refugee and immigrant entrepreneurs through zero interest loans through my venture Dream X America, is that they're always, consistently when they apply for loans, for example, it's about how do I help others? And part of why I think you can't paint with a broad brush, but many refugees are like this, is that they've suffered a lot and they want to build a new community and support others. And they have that level of empathy. And so I say that because even just reaching out to immigrant and refugee communities, whether it's, again, in your house of worship, going to the welcoming center, there are many programs you can find in your city. Just reaching out and being a resource. These are folks who often know zero people in the community. So helping them connect to resources in your network can make a huge difference. And then there are other ways to give as well outside of your community, to UNHCR, to Save the Children, to organizations that are doing kind of the base humanitarian work and some of this kind of entrepreneurial work as well. Probably the last thing I'd say is to think about, to the extent that you have the ability to tell stories and shape perception, whether that's in your job or just in how people are talking. I think it's very important to, again, talk about refugees as people with equal dignity and respect and some of the most powerful, innovative people in the world. Because unless that message gets clear, then countries will continue to be resistant to invest in them at everyone's peril. And so trying to change that narrative however you can would also be useful.
So let's talk a little bit about what's happened since you won the Bracken Bower Prize in 2018. How did winning the award help you to advance the project towards publication?
Yeah, definitely the award was a huge boon and a huge boost for me. And it actually meant really a lot to me. And I say that really sincerely. It was a big deal for a few reasons. I think first, it was just a confidence and encouragement boost. So I think even the application is a confidence boost because you start writing your proposal and you say, actually, this could be a book. And then certainly the recognition with the prize itself was really a wonderful moment for me. And again, a boost and say, okay, people are interested to hear about this, and let me pursue this. So that alone, I mean, both of those components was really big. And then it gave me, there was the financial prize associated with it helped me to then travel to Za'atari camp, travel to Utica, New York, and some other places, and actually start to hear firsthand the stories, which is really what kicked everything off, because it's all, again, centered on the voice of these folks that I'm talking about. So there's that element as well. And then, as far as what I've been up to since then, actually around then I was launching DreamX America, which has had a film streaming on PBS, and then during the pandemic has supported about 45 or so far immigrant, refugee, and first-gen entrepreneurs across the U.S. with $350,000 of zero-interest loans in partnership with the nonprofit Kiva. So that work really built on what I'm doing during the writing, because a lot of the folks I'm working with in Portland, Maine, and Champaign, Illinois, are refugee entrepreneurs who really were heroic during the pandemic. And some of not too much of it got fit into the book, but it just, in terms of my mentality and my heart, it just kept kind of emphasizing what I was doing and why it was important. And also their barriers to accessing capital. So I started seeing it more and more firsthand in my own work as I was also writing the book. And then, started at Stanford University as a Knight Hennessy Scholar at the business school. And even that has continued to, I think there's a lot of joy in like working on a book over time, because a lot of what you're doing can kind of start embedding in it. So being at Stanford, you hear about, millions of venture capital being thrown at ideas. And this is more Silicon Valley broadly, but, lots of capital being put at ideas that, refugee entrepreneurs would have a lot of trouble accessing that kind of money, even though they've proven out their models and often have very incredibly compelling businesses, especially the kind of small businesses and refugee entrepreneurs who don't have connections. And so it was interesting seeing that juxtaposition and saying, actually, the folks at Stanford Business School, including myself, could learn a ton. And I have learned a ton from Esma, Melik, and Yasmina, when, society, I think, views it the other way and says, the folks in Silicon Valley are the inspiring entrepreneurs. But in reality, they often didn't, their risks that are celebrated are not anywhere near as risky as the risks of the refugee entrepreneurs. Their barriers were not as severe. They had backup options often. And so being here has been an interesting juxtaposition. And that actually weaved into the book as well, because I tried to make the point that we get all this leadership and entrepreneurship advice. Really, maybe we should be listening to the folks who have dealt with the most, inhumane situations and have still bounced back with, a woman named Masika in Tricoli camp getting $72 to then start a bakery in the camp that's very successful. Razan in England, who started a halloumi cheese company with a 2,500 pound loan from the government. These are folks with very little capital that make a lot happen despite all of their barriers. So that's just stuff I've been up to, but the prize catalyzed a lot of it.
The Bracken Bower Prize is back. Win the £15,000 prize by submitting a business book proposal today. Brought to you by the Financial Times and McKinsey & Company, we aim to unearth new talent by encouraging young authors under the age of 35 to tackle emerging business themes. Previous winners and finalists have gone on to secure book deals. Some tips for your proposal and what the judges are looking for: knowledge, creativity, originality, and style. They're looking for proposed books that promise to break new ground or examine pressing business challenges in original ways. The deadline for entries is 30th of September. For a chance to win, register your interest today at businessbook.live.ft.com.